A 15-year-old boy crouches behind broken concrete, gripping a weapon too heavy for his thin arms, believing the soldiers approaching will torture him to death. But what happens next will shatter everything he's been taught to believe. This is the story of how American troops faced an unthinkable enemy during World War II's final days. Children sent to kill them. May 12, 1945. The neighborhood in Berlin. Becker, just 15 years old, hides behind debris with an anti-tank weapon resting on his bony shoulders. His hands tremble from terror, weariness, and 3 days of starvation. The uniform given to him 2 weeks earlier hangs loosely on his body. The armband marking him as a People's Militia soldier feels like it's strangling his arm. Through the dust and haze, he hears them approaching. The grinding metal tracks of American tanks, voices shouting commands in English, the organized push that has swept through the city street by street, building by building. This advance forced his group, if you could even call 12 frightened boys and 3 elderly men a group, to keep backing up until there was nowhere left to go. His youth lessons replay in his mind. Americans are savages who murder anyone they capture. Better to die fighting for the leader than give yourself up to beasts without mercy. His squadron commander, an elite guard officer who vanished yesterday, had made it crystal clear: they will hurt you and then kill you. Fight until you die or save your final bullet for yourself. Believed every word. Why wouldn't he? It's all anyone had told him for years. Americans were less than human. Surrendering meant agony and death. His only options were winning or dying. The tank rolls closer, raises his weapon, trying to recall the rushed instructions: point, aim, shoot. His 14-year-old friend had attempted using one yesterday. The blast from behind knocked him out cold. He got shot while lying dazed in the street, killed by machine gun bullets from the tank before he could even stand up. Finds the trigger with his finger. The tank is about 30 meters away now, close enough that he might hit it. Probably not, but if he doesn't shoot, if he doesn't fight back, he's a coward. He's betraying the leader, betraying his country, betraying everything. The tank stops. The gun turret swings around, pointing at where he hides. Shuts his eyes, expecting the cannon to fire and kill him instantly. Instead, a voice calls out loudly, speaking terrible German: "Come out, boy, put down your weapons." Freezes. They called him boy, not enemy, not target, boy. The voice comes again, stronger but not mean. "We won't shoot, come out." Stays frozen. This must be a trick, it has to be. They'll shoot him the second he shows himself. The propaganda made it clear: Americans kill anyone they catch. But the propaganda also said the German army would never retreat, that Germany was winning, that the leader had secret weapons ready to change everything. Watched the army fall apart. He saw Berlin burning. The secret weapons never came. What if the propaganda about Americans was also false? He puts down the weapon with shaking hands. He stands up slowly, lifting his arms above his head. His voice breaks when he calls back, "Don't shoot." 3 American soldiers step out from behind the tank. Their rifles are pointed at him but not firing. They look enormous. Had been told Americans were weak, but these men look like giants in their battle uniforms. One of them is black. The propaganda said black American soldiers were especially brutal. Closes his eyes again, waiting for bullets. Someone grabs his shoulder. Flinches, expecting a blade or a club. Instead, the hand holds him steady, almost gently. When he opens his eyes, one of the Americans, the black soldier he'd been taught to fear most, is holding out a water container. The American says in broken German, "Drink." Stares at the container, at the soldier's face showing worry instead of cruelty, at his own trembling hands as they reach for water offered by an enemy who was supposed to kill him, but is instead giving him something to drink. Drinks. The water tastes clean, cool, better than anything he's had in weeks. When he finishes, the American takes the container back, nods, and points toward the back where other prisoners are gathering. No torture, no execution, just water, a nod, and directions to join other captives sitting on the ground, watched but unhurt. Some are already eating from army food packages the Americans handed out. Walks toward them in shock. His entire understanding of the world falls apart with every step. The monsters are giving him water. The savages aren't killing prisoners. Everything he'd been told was false, and the truth is so surprising he can't make sense of it. The desperate gamble, the People's Militia, was Nazi Germany's final frantic effort to hold off defeat by throwing children and old men against professional armies. Created by the leader's order on September 25, 1944, it drafted all males aged 16 to 60 who weren't already in the military. In reality, as Germany's situation became hopeless, age limits meant nothing. Boys as young as 12 found themselves forced into service. Some joined willingly, brainwashed by years of youth movement propaganda. Others were basically kidnapped, taken from classrooms and homes, given armbands and outdated weapons, sent to defend spots against trained armies. The numbers reveal the desperation. Total drafted during 1944 and 1945, roughly 6 million men and boys. Actually sent into combat, about 1.5 million saw fighting. Teenagers in battle between ages 12 and 17, estimated 100,000 to 150,000. Deaths among teenage soldiers, estimated 40,000 to 60,000 killed, with unknown numbers wounded. Training time, typically 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes just days. Equipment, whatever could be scrounged up. Outdated rifles, stolen weapons, anti-tank rockets, homemade explosives. The children forced into this had been shaped by years of youth movement conditioning. They'd learned that dying for the leader was glorious, that retreating was cowardly, that surrendering was unthinkable dishonor. They'd watched propaganda movies showing Allied soldiers as monsters barely human. They genuinely believed getting caught meant torture and execution. Becker's story was common. 15 years old, he'd been in the youth since age 10. Every week brought military exercises, political training, conditioning to believe in German racial superiority and Allied barbarism. When the People's Militia drafted him in early April 1945, he felt terrified but also strangely proud. He was defending Berlin, fighting for Germany, serving the leader. The reality of combat destroyed those beliefs within hours. His group got 3 days of training: how to shoot a rifle, how to use an anti-tank weapon, where to aim at tanks. Then they were sent to defensive spots and with orders to hold against American forces pushing through the neighborhood. We were 12 boys and 3 old men, remembered in an interview from 1987. The oldest boy was 17, the youngest was 13. We had 8 rifles between us, 4 anti-tank weapons, and maybe 50 bullets total. Our officer was an elite guard soldier who told us we'd be shot if we retreated. Then he disappeared the first day. We were children with guns, terrified, starving, waiting to die. The propaganda that killed. Nazi propaganda had spent years conditioning German children to fear capture more than death. The messaging was organized and everywhere. School books described Allied cruelties. Radio shows detailed supposed massacres of German prisoners. Films showed American and British soldiers as sadistic monsters. Youth movement leaders repeated these messages weekly. Surrender meant torture, assault, execution. Better to die fighting than face what the enemy would do to you. For children already indoctrinated in Nazi racial beliefs, this propaganda took root easily. They'd been taught since age 6 that they were superior, that enemies were less than human, that Germans deserved to rule and others deserved to serve or die. The idea that these supposedly inferior enemies would commit horrors if they once seemed logically consistent with everything else they'd learned. The psychological damage was severe. Many German child soldiers genuinely believed dying in combat was better than getting caught. Some carried poison pills or saved their last bullet for themselves. Others would fight until they passed out rather than give up. The concept of American mercy was literally impossible to imagine. It went against everything they'd been conditioned to believe. 16-year-old Herman, captured near in April 1945, described his terror. "I've been told Americans skinned prisoners alive, that they cut off body parts as souvenirs, that they tortured Germans for fun. When American soldiers surrounded our position and called for surrender, I tried to kill myself. I put my rifle barrel in my mouth. An American knocked it away before I could pull the trigger. I was crying, begging him to just shoot me quickly. He looked horrified. He kept saying something I didn't understand. Later I learned it was Jesus Christ, he's just a kid. But at the time, I thought he was getting ready to torture me. This conditioning made child soldiers incredibly dangerous in combat. They would fight with suicidal determination, knowing or believing that capture meant things worse than death. American forces pushing through Germany ran into pockets of fanatic resistance from teenagers who'd been psychologically prepared to prefer death over surrender. American forces pushing into Germany in early 1945 were unprepared for the organized use of child soldiers. Combat veterans who'd fought across Europe suddenly found themselves facing opponents who were obviously underage. Boys with young faces, thin from hunger, wearing uniforms several sizes too big. The mental disconnect was instant and disturbing. These were children, some young enough to be the American sons or little brothers. But they were firing weapons and needed to be stopped. The rules of combat were clear. Armed enemies were fair targets regardless of age, but the emotional reality was complicated. American soldiers who'd spent months fighting professional German troops found themselves deeply uncomfortable shooting teenagers. Some hesitated fatally. German child soldiers killed or wounded American troops who couldn't bring themselves to fire on children. Others overcame hesitation and shot, then dealt with psychological damage afterward. Sergeant Robert Mitchell from the 3rd Infantry Division described his first encounter with child soldiers near Nuremberg. We were clearing a village when fire came from a building. We returned fire, then stormed the spot. Inside were 5 kids, maybe 14 or 15 years old. 2 were dead from our fire. 3 surrendered. They were terrified, crying, expecting us to execute them. The guy next to me started crying too. He had a son about that age back home. We just killed children because they were shooting at us. There was no good answer to that situation. The encounters created impossible moral dilemmas. German children, indoctrinated and armed, posed real threats. But killing children, even armed hostile children, went against fundamental human instincts and civilized warfare rules. American soldiers found themselves caught between military necessity and moral horror. The solution most groups adopted was aggressive attempts to capture rather than kill. When encountering obvious child soldiers, American forces would call for surrender in German, use loudspeakers to encourage giving up, and hold fire when possible to give children chances to quit fighting. This wasn't official policy. It was individual soldiers and small group leaders making moral choices in the moment. The systematic sparing of German child soldiers represented collective American decision-making at every level: individual soldiers, group commanders, division leadership, occupation authorities. At the tactical level, soldiers who encountered child soldiers often chose to risk their own lives to avoid killing children. They'd advance more carefully, call for surrender more insistently, hold fire longer than tactically smart. Some deliberately aimed to wound rather than kill. Others would bypass child soldier positions entirely if possible, leaving them for following groups to deal with. Private Eugene Henderson described his approach. If I saw a kid with a gun, I'd try everything to get him to surrender before I'd shoot. I'd yell, "Drop your weapon, boy," in German. I'd learned the phrase specifically for this. I'd fire warning shots. I'd wait longer than was safe because if I killed a child, even an armed hostile child, I wasn't sure I could live with that. Some guys did kill kids because they had to, but I tried everything to avoid it. At the command level, policies emerged to handle captured child soldiers differently than adult prisoners. Medical care was prioritized. Food portions were increased. Questioning was gentler. Return to families was rushed when possible. These weren't official regulations. They were practical responses to the uncomfortable reality that American forces were capturing enemy fighters who were obviously children. The psychological impact on American troops was significant. Many soldiers struggled with having killed or wounded child soldiers in combat. Chaplains reported increased counseling requests. Some soldiers wrote home about their moral confusion, knowing they'd done what was necessary but feeling deeply troubled by having harmed children. "I killed a German boy who couldn't have been older than 14, wrote Corporal James to his wife in May 1945. "He had an anti-tank weapon and was about to fire at our tank. I shot him. It was justified. He was armed, hostile, dangerous, but he was a child. When I close my eyes, I see his face. I don't know how to feel about it. I'm glad I'm alive, but I'm haunted by his death." For Becker and tens of thousands of other German child soldiers, capture started psychological transformation as deep as any combat trauma. In the hours after his surrender, sat with other captured militia members, 14 boys ranging from 13 to 17 years old. American soldiers had given them water, field food, and blankets. A medic was treating minor wounds. Guards watched them but showed no cruelty. The expected torture and execution weren't happening. Instead, observed Americans behaving professionally, almost casually. They'd secured the prisoners, provided basics, and moved on to other tasks. The captured children weren't special threats or targets of revenge. They were just another administrative problem to process. This normality was psychologically crushing. Had spent weeks preparing to die gloriously for Germany. He'd believed capture meant unspeakable horrors. Instead, he was sitting on rubble, eating American crackers while his captors mostly ignored him because they had more important things to do. "I kept waiting for the torture to start," remembered. "I'd look at the American guards trying to see the cruelty I'd been promised, but they just looked bored, professional. One was eating chocolate. Another was reading a letter. They weren't monsters preparing to hurt us. They were just soldiers doing their job, and their job apparently included not killing prisoners." An African-American soldier, the one who'd given water initially, approached with more food. Flinched, expecting violence. The soldier noticed, stopped, spoke in careful German. "No one will hurt you." Stared. An American, a black American, supposedly the most savage according to propaganda, was reassuring him of his safety using words chosen specifically to address his fear, showing concern for a child who tried to kill Americans hours earlier. "That was the moment," said decades later, "when that soldier told me no one would hurt me, and I could see in his eyes he meant it. That's when I understood everything I'd believed was propaganda. The lies about American brutality, the racial superiority nonsense, the faith in the leader. It all collapsed because a man I'd been taught was less than human showed me more humanity than my own government ever had." German child soldiers sent to prison camps experienced ongoing challenges to their indoctrination as they discovered American imprisonment meant survival rather than death. The camps held mixed populations, regular Army veterans, elite guard troops, militia members ranging from teenagers to old men. The younger prisoners quickly became known to guards and camp administrators, who made informal allowances for their age. Extra food was common. Educational programs were organized. Some camps separated child prisoners from adults to prevent abuse or continued indoctrination by believers. American chaplains paid special attention to younger prisoners, concerned about their psychological state and future prospects. Becker spent 7 months in a prison camp near Mannheim. His experience contradicted everything the propaganda had promised about captivity. "We were fed regularly, better than I'd eaten in months before capture. We had shelter, medical care, even some recreation. The guards were professional, not cruel. Some were kind. I learned English from a guard who brought me books. He had sons my age and treated me almost like I was one of them." The camps became sites of deprogramming through direct experience rather than formal. Child soldiers who'd believed in the ideology discovered Americans weren't monsters, that propaganda had been systematically false, that their suffering had been for lies. Described his transformation in the camp. "I had time to think without the constant fear and propaganda. I talked to other prisoners, including adults who admitted the war had been wrong. I saw how Americans treated us fairly, humanely, without the cruelty we'd been promised. Slowly, I had to face the truth. I'd fought for evil. I'd been taught lies. Americans weren't the enemy. The regime was. Understanding that was painful but necessary. When German child soldier prisoners were returned to their families after the war, they carried memories that would shape their entire lives and post-war German attitudes toward America. Becker returned to Berlin in November 1945. The city was ruins. His family's home destroyed. His father dead on the Eastern Front. His mother living in a basement. But himself was healthy, well-fed from American food, carrying American-supplied clothes and a letter from the guard who taught him English. His mother barely recognized him. She'd assumed he was dead. Militia casualties had been so high. When explained he'd been captured and held by Americans, she was shocked he'd survived. When he described his treatment, the food, the medical care, the relative kindness, she cried. All the propaganda told us Americans would kill prisoners, she said. I'd mourned for you, certain you were dead or worse. Now you come home healthy, fed, treated well by the people who were supposed to be monsters. Everything they told us was false. This pattern repeated across Germany. Families expecting their children to have been killed or brutalized instead received them back alive, often healthier than when drafted. The contrast between propaganda and reality created the foundation for post-war German attitudes toward America. The psychological impact on the former child soldiers was deep and lasting. Many became advocates for democracy, peace, and German-American friendship. They'd experienced firsthand the difference between government lies and American reality. This created generational effects. Their children and heard stories about Americans sparing their fathers' and grandfathers' lives, treating them humanely, sending them home instead of taking revenge. Peter, whose leg had been saved by American doctors, later wrote, I owe my life to Americans who had every reason to let me die. I'd shot at them. I tried to kill them. They saved me anyway. That mercy taught me more about morality and civilization than any ideology. I spent my life after the war working for peace and democracy because Americans showed me what civilized people do. They spare their enemies when they can. The numbers tell the story. Estimated child soldiers in combat against American forces, 40,000 to 60,000. Killed in action, roughly 15,000 to 20,000. Wounded, roughly 12,000 to 15,000. Captured, roughly 18,000 to 25,000. Captured child soldiers returned alive, roughly 95%. The survival rate among captured child soldiers was notably higher than among adult German prisoners, reflecting both American prioritization of children's welfare and lower rates of disease and complications among younger prisoners. Child soldiers receiving medical treatment in American facilities, roughly 4,200. Surgical procedures, 892. Amputations, often necessary due to combat trauma, 134. Artificial limbs provided, 89. Post-war medical follow-up arranged, roughly 2,800 cases. Post-war return numbers. Child soldiers processed through prison camps, roughly 20,000. Average time in custody, 6 to 9 months. Provided education and job training while imprisoned, roughly 8,000. Released to families or social services, 95%. Estimated deaths in American custody from all causes, less than 500. These numbers documented that American forces, facing child soldiers in combat, killed when necessary but captured when possible, treated wounded without regard to age or nationality, imprisoned humanely, and released systematically. The contrast with how the regime treated enemies, or even its own children sent to die, was absolute. For American soldiers who'd fought against and captured German child soldiers, the experience created lasting moral complexities. Many struggled with having killed children, even armed hostile children who'd been trying to kill them. The psychological burden persisted for decades. Veterans would describe dreams about teenage faces, guilt about actions that were militarily justified but emotionally devastating. Sergeant Robert Mitchell, who'd killed 2 militia teenagers in combat near Nuremberg, carried that burden for 50 years. I did what I had to do. They were shooting at us. They'd have killed my men if I hadn't stopped them. I know intellectually I made the right choice, but emotionally I killed children. That's something I've had to live with every day since. I see their faces. I wonder who they might have become if the leader hadn't sent them to die. Others found redemption through capturing and sparing child soldiers when possible. Private Eugene Henderson, who made extraordinary efforts to avoid killing children in combat, described complex feelings. I'm glad I didn't have to kill kids, but I also feel guilty about the American soldiers who died because someone else hesitated or showed mercy that got them killed. War forces impossible choices. I made the choices I could live with, but that doesn't mean they were easy or without cost. The experience influenced post-war American attitudes toward Germany and militarization of children. American forces occupying Germany enforced strict demilitarization, including abolishing all youth movement organizations and military training for minors. The memory of fighting child soldiers created determination to prevent any future generation from being similarly exploited. We'd fought children who'd been turned into weapons, reflected Captain William Hayes, who'd commanded troops in Germany. That wasn't their fault. It was their government's crime. Our job after the war was to make sure German children would never be used that way again. That meant building a democratic Germany where children went to school, not battlefields. Berlin, May 1945. A makeshift American processing center for German prisoners. Becker sat with 14 other former militia members, boys aged 13 to 17, waiting to be transported to permanent camps. They'd been captured at various times over the past week, brought here, fed, given basic medical checks, and now waited for whatever came next. An American soldier, the same black soldier who'd given water on the day of his capture, approached with a box. He opened it to reveal chocolate bars. He handed them out to the German boys, one per prisoner, speaking in broken German, "For you, good children," stared at the chocolate bar. The last time he'd tasted chocolate was before the war, when he was 9 years old. 6 years ago, when the world had still made sense, when he'd been a child instead of a soldier. The American noticed's expression. "War is over," he said. "War is over." Then in English that was beginning to understand, "You get to be kids again," looked around at the other boys. Some were crying silently. Others were staring at their chocolate like, unable to process this simple kindness from people they'd been taught were monsters. A few were already eating, the immediate pleasure of sugar overcoming weeks of propaganda conditioning. He took a bite. The sweetness was overwhelming, not just the chocolate but the meaning. The Americans had defeated them, captured them, and instead of the torture and execution they'd been promised, they received chocolate. Instead of revenge, mercy. Instead of death, life. And the chance to be children again. Began crying, not from fear or hunger or pain, but from the collapse of everything he'd believed. The propaganda had been lies. The Americans weren't monsters. He'd nearly died fighting for evil, and the people who defeated that evil were treating him with more kindness than his own government had ever shown. The American soldier looked concerned. "Everything okay?" Nodded, unable to speak. He held up the chocolate bar in trembling hands, a gesture of thanks that crossed language barriers. The soldier understood, nodded back, moved on to give out more chocolate to more children who'd been sent to fight and kill for a government that had betrayed them. In that moment, with chocolate melting in his mouth and tears streaming down his face, Becker understood what mercy meant. It meant Americans giving chocolate to German boys who tried to kill them. It meant treating children like children, even when those children had been turned into soldiers. It meant choosing humanity over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, future possibility over past crimes. The war was over. Becker was 15 years old, and for the first time in years he had a future worth living for, given to him by enemies who'd become his liberators, who'd shown him that even after the worst humanity could inflict, mercy remained possible.